Yes.
So when we left off yesterday afternoon, we looked at some passages in Dr. Smith's various statements relating to knowledge and understanding of hepatitis, both in terms of his own, his understanding of the perception of fractionators, and then his understanding of the perception of clinicians, more generally. There were then just a handful of contemporaneous documents I wanted to look at. They derived from 1981, and in relation to the first two documents, they were described by Dr. Smith in his statement as some first outline proposals to tackle virus transmission generated in 1981. So, Paul, could we have CBLA 00012991? This is 27th of February 1981, and is, as I understand the statements of Dr. Smith, a document authored by him, although it doesn't bear any particular name. But it says, proposal for support of a research project titled The Development of Methods for the Production of Coagulation Factor Concentrates with Reduced Risk of Hepatitis Transmission. The first paragraph starts by talking about improvements in methods for the detection of hepatitis B surface antigen, and says that's drastically reduced the incidence of hepatitis B in patients receiving factor 8 and factor 9 concentrates. And then adds this. This change has also highlighted the importance of non-A, non-B hepatitis as an undesirable side effect of transfusion of blood and blood products. Although there is some evidence that the risk of transmitting non-A, non-B hepatitis is greater for imported blood products, and then again a reference to Dr. Krask's 1980 paper, the incidence of non-A, non-B hepatitis following infusion of NHS concentrates is still a cause for concern. And then there's reference to two further papers in the next paragraph. And then the third paragraph picks it up by saying the significance of a product demonstrably free of hepatitis risk cannot be ignored. And it is essential that BPL/PFL be well placed to take advantage of such developments, since this particular development work involves the handling of large quantities of plasma known to be infective. The choice of a location for the work is important. Clearly, the work would have to be sited outside the regular production area. So that's what Dr. Smith described as first outline raising of this matter. And then a second document referenced in I think the statement from the HIV litigation is at BPLL 001141. This is a little later in 1981, 27th of July 1981, a memo from Dr. Smith to Dr. Lane, reduction of HBV infectivity of therapeutic concentrates. And Dr. Smith says this, for historical reasons over and above the line of duty, I'm very interested in this topic, but have not had facilities to pursue it since coming to England. Now that we know a lot more and Brian Combridge has relatively safe preparative facilities, a bit of cross-fertilisation would seem to be in order. I summarise some pursuits which would involve spiking products with infective virus, inactivation or removal of virus by simple manipulations, on testing for possible infectivity by controlled tests in chimpanzees, possibly the only evidence currently deserving credibility. Now, this is, as we see from the heading, concerned with reduction of hepatitis B infectivity. But I draw attention to it, not least because of what's said in paragraph 1. I think Mr. Hill may have referred to this in the course of the week. But there is a reference to the work being undertaken by Beringwerk in relation to heating and the claim of producing a non-effective factor 8 concentrate. Dr. Smith says there's no reputable evidence for the claim. I would have a few ideas on how to start, but this might more probably be an R&D project. And then he goes on in the following paragraphs to talk about factor 9 and suggests a discussion that might take place with Mr. Watt at PFC in that regard. And then discusses, if we go just further down the page, please, Paul, discusses ideas in relation to other products and then says at the very end, I'm out of date on the virology side, would welcome further discussions with you and Brian. Those are two documents from 1981 raising thoughts about work that might be taken, but not really going any further than that. There's then, if we go to CBLA 00014446, there's then, as we see here, a meeting in September 1981, 14th of September 1981, between Dr. Lane, Dr. Harvey and Dr. Smith. This is in fact Dr. Lane's note of the meeting. His name and the date of the 21st of September appears on page 2. We can see the subject, hepatitis antigens in plasma and final products, submissions for research and development products, object of the meeting to set out important areas of research and development. And then if we look at the first paragraph, headed hepatitis antigens in plasma and final products, we see, and again, Mr. Hill made reference to this issue earlier in the week, we see their attention being drawn to what was going on commercially in terms of commercial products. The point was made that various commercial manufacturers have now produced both factor 8 and factor 9 products, claiming that in-process modifications have now substantially reduced the risk of transmission of hepatitis. The basis for these claims may lack scientific integrity, but the ethical pressure brought on clinicians to use such products is clearly established. It's known that certain companies are actively seeking product licenses on the UK market. BPL therefore cannot rest its case in this area using a purist argument that the term essentially free of hepatitis risk is meaningless, or because precise definition of complete exclusion of hepatitis viruses falls outside our existing methods of detection, accepting transmission in primates. And then it would appear there's a discussion of a range of approaches for reducing hepatitis antigen. I'm not proposing to go through them all. The second is heat inactivation, but there's a number of others there set out. 9 is general forms of chemical virus inactivation. Some of these alternative potential ways of reducing hepatitis transmission are discussed in more detail in Dr. Smith's 1990 statement. The note continues, the advantages and or disadvantages of each of these systems was briefly considered with respect both to factor 8 and to factors 2, 7, 9 and 10. There's some general conclusions there set out. If we go over the page, we see then submissions for research and development proposals, projects, reference to a meeting of the Scientific and Technical Committee. Again, Mr. Hill made reference to that. And then we see in the second paragraph, the director, so Dr. Lane, invited MJH, that's Dr. Harvey, and JKS, so Dr. Smith, to proceed with the submissions in areas of, and then there's a range of areas set out, including hepatitis transmission. I'm not going to go through the remaining documents in this reference, but if we just go to the next page, you'll see there that this is an extract from a meeting of the Scientific and Technical Committee where reference is made to research projects. If we go to CBLA 00015006, then next. This is the later meeting of the Scientific and Technical Committee for the Central Blood Laboratories, 24th of November 1981. And we can see, if we look at the list of attendees, that Dr. Smith attended for item 1. And then if we look at item 1, it says Dr. Smith gave a short address on the inactivation of hepatitis in BPL products. A summary is attached at Annex A. And if we go to page 5, we've got the summary. It is very much only a summary, so we don't have any more detail. But what this document, which we can see was authored by Dr. Smith, says is the review covered the consequences of transmitting both B and non-A, non-B hepatitis viruses, the incidence of infection among multi-transfused haemophiliacs, and the special problem of infrequently transfused patients who had no immunological defence. The risk of transmitting hepatitis might be diminished by more specific and sensitive screening of blood donations intended for fractionation, limiting the size of plasma pools for recovery of certain products, neutralisation or adsorption of virus with an excess of hepatitis antibody, vaccination of recipients, selective removal of viruses during fractionation, e.g. by precipitation with PEG, and by inactivation of virus, e.g. with B-propiolactone, or by heating in the presence of reagents preserving the biological activities of plasma proteins. A policy was suggested for the selective application of these approaches to individual coagulation factor concentrates. So we can see there in the course of 1981, thought being given, in particular by Dr. Smith, to possible methods of reducing or addressing the risks of transmission of hepatitis. But at this point in time, it's still very much a subject for discussion with a range of different options or potential options being identified. If we then just turn to Dr. Smith's 1990 draft proof of evidence, so CBLA 5016_034, please, Paul. And we go to page 34. If we just look at the opening words of paragraph 87, bottom half of the page, this is in a section of Dr. Smith's statement which deals with restricted pool trials, which I'll come on to. But we can just see from the first sentence what may be a shift in position as between 1981 and 1983. What Dr. Smith there says, in 1983, BPL was very concerned about the incidence of non-A, non-B hepatitis after first use of factor 8 and factor 9 concentrates in previously untreated patients, even though the source plasma was from unpaid UK donors. He goes on then to talk about AIDS, which I'll come on to in a moment, but explains a few lines down, we were interested in non-A, non-B hepatitis first and foremost. So the work that was being undertaken by 1983 had been triggered, as we see from the 1981 documents, by concerns about hepatitis transmission, albeit, as Dr. Smith's evidence as a whole makes clear, it was then the advent of AIDS that really galvanised and introduced a sense of greater urgency, and indeed which led in due course to the focus upon heat treatment. I won't go to it, but it's paragraph 103 of Dr. Smith's statement to this inquiry, in which, again, he says in terms, AIDS brought about a greater degree of urgency to the work. So if I turn then just to a handful of references in Dr. Smith's evidence about the developing awareness of AIDS, if we go to his first Penrose statement, which is PRSE 0004045. And if we turn to page 8, what we'll see in a moment is a couple of passages in Dr. Smith's evidence, which again draws a degree of distinction between what he says fractionators thought about AIDS and the possible connection with blood, and what his perception was of the position of clinicians on that same issue. So if we pick it up towards the bottom of that page, the penultimate paragraph in bold italics, he says this: there was some resistance among haemophilia clinicians to the idea that AIDS was caused by a blood-borne virus. And then he adds he didn't think that affected the urgency felt by the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service. And then if we go to the top of the next page, he then says, in relation to the position of fractionators, I believe that most fractionators thought it likely that AIDS was caused by a blood-borne virus, even before the seminal publication by Montagnier's group. And then he refers to his recollection, both of when it was published, but that it was taken by transfusionists as strong support for a working hypothesis. So that was his evidence to the Penrose inquiry in writing. If we then go to Dr. Smith's statement to this inquiry, WITN 3433001, go first of all to page 14, please. Sorry, if I pick it up, bottom of page 13. Sorry, Paul. So you'll see the very bottom of the page, reference was made to what he'd said in his Penrose statement, and he was asked essentially to expand upon that. If we go over the page, I won't read all of it, but he says in paragraph 42, in 1982, AIDS seemed to be confined to homosexuals, Haitians and haemophiliacs. It was hard for many to accept the transmission by body fluids could be a common factor. As more and more categories and individuals acquired symptoms of AIDS and the subversion of the immune system began to dominate many investigations, it became easier to see that as the key. And then he refers to a counter-hypothesis. Paragraph 43, he provides some further observations about what was essentially the counter view, the counter-hypothesis. So we see, for example, he talks in the fourth line about some US companies encouraging the belief that junk protein was causing immunological damage, and describes resistance to a viral cause alone continuing after the Montagnier publication. If we then pick it up in 44, paragraph 44, however, he says this: I imagine that by 1983, most blood transfusion professionals had concluded that the patterns of AIDS transmission strongly suggested involvement of a blood-borne virus. And then he refers to the Barré-Sanusi publication, probably putting it beyond reasonable doubt. But it's really, I think, perhaps the first part of that sentence that's most important. And then if we go to page 38, paragraph 105, he says this, perhaps we should just look at the question, sorry, if we just look at the bold question beforehand, Paul. So there's a reference again there to Dr. Smith's Penrose statement, reference to the Groningen Conference in November 1984. And he says there, he's referring to fractionators, not to those clinicians whose long resistance to the viral hypothesis was well established. So again, there appears to be a distinction being drawn in Dr. Smith's mind between the approach of fractionators and the approach of clinicians. And then finally, in terms of references to understanding of AIDS, if we go to PRSE 00006059, this is just a short reference in Dr. Smith's oral testimony to the Penrose inquiry. If we go to page 71, we can see from line 6, we've got there the publication date for the article that Dr. Smith had been referring to, 20th of May 1983. And then lines 12 to 14, Dr. Smith was asked about when he first heard about AIDS. When you first heard about AIDS, and more particularly heard about people with haemophilia having AIDS, can you remember what your reaction was? And his response was, I first heard about it from my American colleague who brought back a cutting from the Boston Globe. I did not hear about AIDS through the scientific literature first. And he was asked if he could remember when that was roughly, and answered perhaps even 1982. And then if we just go over the page, he goes back at lines 10 to 14, or he's asked again about the publication in May of 1983. He says, he's asked, you recollect the publication was taken by transfusionists as strong support for a working hypothesis, that is a working hypothesis for a blood-borne virus being involved. His answer is exactly. So that's a flavour of what Dr. Smith had to say in his various statements and oral testimonies about his understanding in relation to AIDS. What was done in response to that in terms of the viral inactivation programme, I'll come on to it shortly. So the third theme I wanted to explore through Dr. Smith's evidence is the question of the facilities and resources available at PFL and BPL. We'll no doubt be able to hear more evidence about that from Dr. Snape in due course. But we can get some of what Dr. Smith had to say from various sources. If we start with PRSC 000 6059, sorry, I think it's the document we just had up. Yes, if we go to page 42, we can see there that Dr. Smith was asked in the course of his testimony to the Penrose inquiry about the Lister Institute and the facilities. He described there the site moving to Elstree. And then if we go to the next page, we pick it up at line 9. He says it, and he's talking there about BPL. It had its share of tin huts, but the fractionation was slightly more salubrious than that. At the time I went to Oxford, that was 1975 when he joined Oxford, research had been confined to the tin huts, and we were operating in reasonable circumstances, although all was tightly circumscribed by the breadth of our ambitions and the space we had to work in. And then the chair posed the observation, and the narrowness of your pockets, answer indeed. And then Dr. Smith continued, I should perhaps say that the blood transfusion in Oxford at that time was operating in twin Nissen huts on precisely the same site. And there was an infamous Oxford triangle, so that picks up upon the virtuous triangle, which we looked at yesterday in his witness statement to this inquiry, which served later for self-sufficiency in England. And if we just carry on, he talks about the plasma being collected in great amounts by the very willing and helpful transfusion service. It was fractionated in the fractionation lab 50 yards away in a brick building and infused into patients 20 yards away. It was a lovely model of what can be done if everyone gets behind it. So that may cast some further light upon what we were discussing yesterday, sir. And then if we go towards the bottom of this page, he was asked, again, some questions about facilities at Elstree, building works being undertaken. And at line 17 said this, I'll try and be brief and non-committal about this, but in 1978 or early 1979, for the first time, the medicines inspectors were allowed into BPL, which had hitherto, under the previous director, insisted on operating under Crown immunity. It was plain to progressive people that this was not going to last forever. Crown immunity was going to be removed from little pharmacies and equally from fractionation laboratories eventually. Reluctantly, the medicines inspectors were, just go to the top of the next page, were allowed in, did not like what they saw, perhaps especially in the coagulation factor side. The medicines inspectors were very helpful in explaining to us what was required in 1979. And then he goes on to talk about the need, essentially, for further work to be undertaken and a reference to Mark I programme. And then if we just go a little further down the page, please, Paul. Perhaps I can pick it up at, yes, if we pick it up at line 13, he refers to what he described as the crash programme of renovating, improving the existing premises. And then he refers to being seconded from Oxford to start both these exercises as they concern, insofar as they concerned coagulation factors. We had at the same time as continuing to reduce factor 8 and factor 9 I think that should be produce rather than reduce, in less than perfect circumstances to rebuild step by step or at least improve the facilities in each area in turn. This was a very difficult programme. And then he explains that the old building had to continue to process plasma much later than hoped because the building programme for the new BPL took rather longer than planned. So those were some observations in the oral evidence to the Penrose inquiry. If we then turn back to Dr. Smith's statement to this inquiry, WITN 3433001, and we go to page 28, please. There are then some further observations that Dr. Smith made in response to a question about the resources available for research and development at BPL and PFL. And he said this, paragraph 83, when I came to PFL in 1975, there was no recognisable R&D department at BPL. Any coagulation factor development being done was in the margins of production. Dr. M.J. Harvey was appointed head of R&D at BPL around 1980 and set up labs and staff for this purpose. Skipping over a sentence, effectively, however, all work on coagulation factors was delegated to PFL. And then if we look at the bottom of the page, he talks about taking de facto charge of R&D resources at PFL when Dr. Bidwell retired. If we go over the page, we then get a further sense of the fairly limited numbers of staff involved. Picking it up, fifth line down, the only full-time member of staff in R&D at the beginning of 1983 was Mrs. Lowell Winkleman, who had considerable experience as an R&D scientist, though possibly not initially employed under that title. She had to work on both Factor 8 and 9 until in early 1983 we had permission to recruit Dr. Peter Feldman. Both scientists quickly absorbed our policy of seeing a candidate product from the lab bench through to large-scale production at BPL by way of PFL's pilot-scale production. PFL followed a principle of using industrial equipment which could be easily scaled up at BPL. This integrated approach was reinforced by constant interaction between R&D pilot plant and the QC analytical lab on site, one of the few benefits of having limited staff and space, and was happily assisted by the generous personalities of the main players. And then the next paragraph explains that there was an absence of permanent technical staff. So he says another unusual feature of PFL in that period was that the R&D scientists had no permanent technical staff. Instead, the production staff, many of whom were of an inquiring mind, were given a chance to collaborate on lab-scale work with the scientists, being released for about a day a week as production schedules permitted and as an R&D project matured. I would estimate today that on average the scientists had technical assistance 1 or 2 days a week. He then in the next paragraph sets out the advantage of having close interaction with the Oxford Haemophilia Centre. If we then go over the page, there's a description in paragraph 87, I'm not going to read it, but I draw attention to it, of the infrastructure at PFL. Paragraph 88 explains there were no facilities or staff for virus work at PFL and none at BPL capable of handling highly pathogenic viruses until completion of the new R&D department in the late 1980s. There's then a description of the QC lab under Dr. Snape, but I'll leave that because we're going to be hearing directly from Dr. Snape. And then if we go to the next page, paragraph 90, he talks here about facilities at BPL. Picking it up in the third line, the citation from my evidence to the oral hearings in Penrose emphasises the defining limitation on our pasteurising work. We knew that it could not be exploited at BPL until the new plant had been completed and qualified. And then he explains why pasteurisation required facilities that BPL did not have. If we skip down a few lines, he just explains it was impossible to install such a facility in the existing buildings at BPL, and then goes on to explain, by contrast with pasteurization, in relation to the dry heating, what was required was the large-scale ovens in order to scale up the work on 8Y and 9A. If we then go to page 33, paragraph 93, I'm not going to read this out, but just to note, there is Dr. Smith's observations comparing the facilities at PFL and BPL with the facilities at PFC, where he said space had been allowed for R&D and pilot operations. And then if we go to page 34, paragraph 95, he says this: obviously, if the new BPL had already been built by, say, 1980, people like me would have had a more orderly life, might have been able to create more options for virus reduction. As it was, we spent a lot of time working around builders renovating the old premises and in introducing training in modern pharmaceutical practices in preparation for the new BPL. So there was some of the physical constraints. However, it's only fair to point out that Dr. Smith then continued, I believe I kept abreast of the virus inactivation field throughout, and would like to think that if there had appeared any chink of light about how we might tackle non-A, non-B hepatitis, I would have noticed it and acted accordingly. In the very early 80s, more time would not necessarily have meant more inspiration. I would like to have had the kind of physical facilities necessary to exploit pasteurization, and it is conceivable that had PFL been able to combine efforts with PFC, we might both have arrived at a common goal sooner, but even in retrospect that seems unlikely. As it happened, it was fortunate that we pursued complementary approaches. And then finally, in this document, page 36, he was asked the question of whether there had been more resources available to those working on heat treatment. Would effective heat-treated products have been produced at an earlier date? To which his answer is essentially he doesn't think so. Obviously said these were matters for you to assess, looking at all the available evidence. But this is what Dr. Smith had to say. A number of things would have been nice to have and might have made us more confident of success, but would not have accelerated the programme significantly. More coagulation assays might have allowed us to optimise parts of the process more thoroughly, but with 8Y, our path to successful purification and formulation, which usually call for much laborious trial and error, was remarkably smooth. The hitches, which always appeared during scale-up, were few and relatively easily solved. Having our own facilities on the BPL site for virus spiking, etc., might have allowed us to cover more variables and to measure the additional inactivation achieved at our higher temperatures, but would not have led to earlier availability of our severely heated 8Y and 9A. So there is Dr. Smith's response to the question posed. You'll obviously hear and be able to hear directly from Dr. Snape his own recollection from a slightly different perspective, because obviously his involvement was essentially in relation to quality control. But he will be able to tell you his recollections of the facilities available at both PFL and at BPL prior to the redevelopment. So the next theme arising out of Dr. Smith's evidence relates to the relationship between BPL and PFL on the one hand and the PFC in Edinburgh on the other. You will hear, both when we look at Dr. Lane's evidence later today and when we look at self-sufficiency and domestic production in Scotland and Northern Ireland next week, you will hear some evidence of a degree of tensions between PFC and BPL, at least in relation to the relationship between Dr. Lane and Mr. Watt. It's right, however, to note that Dr. Smith's evidence, both to the Penrose inquiry and in his statement to this inquiry, painted a more harmonious picture in terms of his own dealings, in particular with Dr. Foster. And of course, we'll be hearing from Dr. Foster next week, and we'll be able to see what Dr. Foster has to say about that. And so if I can just pick up a couple of references in Dr. Smith's statement of this inquiry. So if we can have back WITN 3433001, please, Paul. If we go to bottom of page 21, please. What Dr. Smith said in paragraph 66 at the bottom of the page was this: I was the main PFL BPL link to our friends in PFC and their work, sharing with them anything which I thought might help their endeavours on the pasteurisation option. As time went on, our respective scientists were encouraged to form their own links with each other, but factual communication was normally between me and Dr. Peter Foster, or with our blessing. Such exchanges were not scheduled on a regular basis and never sought to change the other's policies or strategies. However, we could be confident that the lines PFC were following were in the most competent hands so that we did not have to duplicate their efforts. It always seemed that our confidence was reciprocated. Those at BPL and PFC who were formerly in senior positions to ourselves appeared to understand the nature of our cooperation. And as I say, we'll look at what the perception of Dr. Lane and Mr. Watt might have been in relation to those issues. But Dr. Smith paints a picture of there being certainly a degree of dialogue and sharing of information between him and his scientific colleagues with Dr. Foster at PFC.
And mutual respect.
And mutual respect. And then if we go to page 32 in the same document, we can see that Dr. Smith listed what he said was some of the most important and tangible debts we owed to PFC. Don't need to go through all of those, but I think perhaps just pick up a couple of them. So the third bullet point, providing details as PFC work developed of promising pasteurization processes for factor 8 and factor 9. Sharing early reports from some conferences which we could not attend, most significantly concerning Behring Works' progress on pasteurising factor 9 and Rubinstein's on dry heating. Sharing access to the dog DIC trials which confirmed that 9A was not thrombogenic. That reference will become clearer when we look at the heat treatment work in relation to factor 9. Sharing the results of PFC's attempts to explain the resistance of 8Y and other formulations to high temperatures. So those are some practical examples which Dr. Smith listed of information sharing, etc., between the scientists at PFL and the scientists at PFC. Then if we go to page 35, please, Paul, paragraph 98, Dr. Smith said this, in relation to the relationship between BPL, PFL and PFC, it should be clear that this relationship was extremely rewarding, at first in PFL's favour, and perhaps more equally when non-A, non-B hepatitis was eclipsed by AIDS, and we both had to accelerate exploitation of our dry heating experiences. A contemporaneous example of discussions between Oxford and Scotland appears in a note from Dr. Smith at CBLA 0002481. So you'll see, if we look at the head of the page, this is a memo from Dr. Smith, 15th of February 1983, to Dr. Harvey, Dr. Lane, Dr. Snape, and others at BPL, headed Visit to SNBTS Protein Fractionation Centre and Headquarters Seminar in February 1983. And he says there, the first day was spent with Dr. Foster and Dr. MacLeod of R&D Department, mainly on heat inactivation of hepatitis viruses in coagulation factor concentrates under the protection of glycine and sorbitol. And then, I don't think we need to go through it in any particular detail, but we can see from the headings there was a discussion about the work being undertaken in relation to factor 8. We can see from the next heading there's a discussion about the work being undertaken in relation to factor 9. and we'll see in the second paragraph under the heading Factor 9, it says we agreed to continue sharing information on this. And then the heading Other Information on Virus Inactivation suggests that there was a discussion about what else was going on outside of Edinburgh, outside of Oxford and Elstree. So there's a discussion of what it's thought is being undertaken by the commercial pharmaceutical companies. I just draw attention, I don't think one can necessarily make much of it, but the very last few lines on that page, you'll see the reference to immuno, and then it says unconfirmed speculation from Dr. Bolton's note of Immuno's recent seminar. Is the chairman, Professor Bloom, reporting to us, ? I don't know whether that's a reference to the January 1983 meeting at London Airport. It may well be.
It sounds like it.
It does sound like it. And then if we go over the page, under the heading miscellaneous, if we just look at the last paragraph, again, this is relevant to the question of the sharing of information between the different organisations. Dr. Smith said, I was given a copy of PFC's 1982 R&D reports without strings. I propose to acknowledge receipt, formally keep custody of the collection, but obviously interested parties will wish to consult them. I will circulate copies of content. So, again, we can no doubt explore that further with Dr. Foster next week, but that was Dr. Smith's recollection of that particular visit. And then finally, Dr. Smith's evidence to the Penrose inquiry looked at the question of the relationship between England and Scotland in this regard. It was obviously a matter of greater concern to the Penrose inquiry, so there were a number of questions that Dr. Smith was asked about the extent to which there was any degree of working together between the different fractionation centres. And you'll recall that Dr. Smith produced a supplemental note which addressed this issue specifically. So if we go to that, please, it's PRSE 0004368. Page 8. So this was Dr. Smith's supplemental note 6 on collaboration between the PFC and PFL, BPL in the period 1981 to 1987. You'll see the headings in Dr. Smith's terms, I think, rather than terms which the Penrose inquiry had used. So the first is the huff. And I'm not going to go through the various documents which are referenced here, but we can, I think, get a sense of what Dr. Smith was referring to. He refers to a note from Dr. Cash and says, Dr. Cash puts at least the Scottish case for a history of cross-border negativity. The same note also unwittingly reveals prejudices of the kind which may explain why some Scottish bridges might end in mid-air, having neglected or hindered the construction of a pier on the opposite bank. One might speculate that senior levels may have felt able to maintain uncompromising positions, secure in the knowledge that they would not be identified with interrupting scientific and technical progress. And then he refers to an apparent impasse between PFC and BPL. So, without wanting to anticipate evidence that we may hear in due course, there is a sense of some degree of difficulty, some degree of hostility in relationships between PFC and BPL or PFL. What Dr. Smith goes on then to say in this note is that certainly didn't translate, if it existed, it didn't translate into any impediment to the working relationship and sharing of information between him and his colleagues and Dr. Foster and his colleagues. And I'm not going to go through the note in any detail. It would take too long to read out. But we can see, for example, if we just go to the bottom paragraph on this page, he refers to Dr. Foster generally keeping information on pasteurization flowing. He talks about PFC keeping him informed of various approaches that they were undertaking and so on. And then finally on this topic, again as part of the Penrose evidence, if we go to PRSE 0002057, these are, as we saw yesterday, Dr. Smith's comments on a chronology put together by the Penrose inquiry. We just go to page 3. If we look towards the bottom of the page, you will see there a reference. I'll pick it up, I hope, when we get to the statement of Dr. Lane. But there was a reference to there being furtive arrangements between Dr. Smith and Dr. Foster. And you can see this is from Dr. Cash. Just above the italicised passage, it says, "It's my intention to see what I can do to build these bridges. I do not regard the existing furtive arrangements as regards Factor 8 between Jim Smith and Peter Foster, however good they may be, as a sound basis upon which the NHS fractionators can combat the commercial people." Dr. Smith's observation is this: "I continue to be puzzled by Dr. Cash's term furtive." And then he refers to the establishment of a group of which Dr. Foster was an active member, and he says that Dr. Smith, was in touch with other members of the group throughout the period of interest that was never characterised as furtive. And it's right to note that Dr. Lane also said, well, there was nothing furtive. We knew that Dr. Smith and Dr. Foster were in contact. And then if we go over the page, if we just pick up the second box, this refers to a letter from Dr. Foster to Dr. Smith. We don't need to look at the underlying letter, but the general observation that Dr. Smith made, this is the third line of the italicised section, PRF, that's Dr. Foster, is offering encouraging results very freely, and it would seem that I was responding in kind, since he raises topics obviously of continuing interest to both of us. The final paragraph confirms that we respected confidentiality and knew that there would sometimes be limitations on sharing. And then, yes, sorry, if we just go towards the bottom of the page, it's the third box from the bottom. There's reference to another letter from Dr. Foster to Dr. Smith, this in May of 1983, and Dr. Smith's italicised comment illustrates continuing expectations of shared interests and free contact at a scientific level with BPL, as well as with JKS, that's Dr. Smith at PFL. So that's Dr. Smith's account, or a potted summary of Dr. Smith's account of the relationship from his perspective, at least with his scientific colleagues in Edinburgh. So the next topic to touch on relates to some observations Dr. Smith made in his statement to this inquiry about pool sizes and some of the specific work that was then undertaken at PFL in relation to what was described as limited donor or restricted donor pools. There'll be a broader look in the course of one of next week's presentations more widely at pool sizes, so I'm not going to seek to anticipate that, but I'm just going to draw your attention to what it is Dr. Smith said in his witness statement on the topic. We can pick it up in his statements to this inquiry at WYTN 3433001. Page 41. And you'll see he identifies 3 different kinds of starting pool. Normal pools, that's paragraph 114. Small pools, paragraph 115. And then if we just briefly go to page 43, paragraph 120, limited donor pools. So those are three types of pools which Dr. Smith then described further in his statement. If we go back to page 41, I'm going to start by looking at what he said about normal pools. So he said this in paragraph 114, unless noted below, the default pool size was 200 litres, containing about 800 single donations at PFL, and up to 1,500, about 6,000 donations at BPL. So that was the normal size, 800 at PFL, 6,000 at BPL. It does change from time to time, but I'm not going to try and pick up that level of detail today. The standard product produced at PFL and at BPL was made from these normal pools. So HL was produced by BPL from these normal pools. 8CVR was produced at PFL from these normal pools. And then if we go to page 44, we can see, I don't need to read it, but at paragraph 121, Dr. Smith set out the products that were made from the normal pools. The standard vial of intermediate purity concentrate. And then if we go to, I think it's, no, I'm sorry, I've missed the reference. I can give you the reference in the presentation in any event. Although the PFL pools were smaller than the BPL pools, Dr. Smith said they were never less than 300 donations and at no time fitted within a definition of what would be described as a small pool. So that's the position in relation to the bulk of the factor concentrates produced by PFL and BPL. If we then look at Dr. Smith's observations about small pools, if we have the statement back on screen, Paul, and go to page 41. So there's a description in paragraph 115 and over the page about small pools. I don't propose to look at that in any detail this morning because what Dr. Smith there sets out, as his statement makes clear, was not actually something that was in use at either PFL or BPL. There are two contemporaneous documents which contain some discussion about issues relating to pool sizes, however. So if we start with CBLA 0001342_001, CBLA 0001342_001. No? Do you have BPLL 0007526, Paul? Okay. Before we look at the document that we do have, I'll just tell you what the other document is, and if necessary, we can produce it for display after the break. The first document I referred to, and the reference for the transcript is CBLA 301342_001, is a document authored by Dr. Smith, 27th of April 1981, and it's called A Comparison of Freeze-Dried Cryoprecipitate and Intermediate Purity Concentrates as Major Products for National Self-Sufficiency in Factor 8. I think I can probably just tell you what's in it without the need to show it to you. It contains a discussion by Dr. Smith of frozen cryoprecipitate. It then sets out his knowledge of production of small pool freeze-dried cryoprecipitate in other countries, in particular Netherlands, Finland and Switzerland are referenced. He then talks about some use of large pool freeze-dried cryoprecipitate and different approaches being taken in Belgium and in France, and then talks about intermediate purity concentrate made from larger pools, which obviously was the product that was the product being produced at PFC and BPL. He undertakes a comparison of the relative factor 8 yields of the two different types of product, the freeze-dried cryo on the one hand and the intermediate purity concentrate on the other. And then I'll just read his conclusion, which is short, before we then look at the document on screen. He said, small pool frozen or freeze-dried cryoprecipitate has unique advantages for patients needing only infrequent treatment. The best means of meeting these requirements will receive more detailed consideration so that the conflicting aims of factor 8 yield, pool size, manufacturing, hygiene and quality control can be reconciled. However, a close examination of yields, taken with a consensus of opinion on the relative safety and convenience of the two kinds of product, supports the conclusion that the major component in our national strategy for factor 8 production should be intermediate purity concentrate. So I draw attention to that because it's a 1981 comparison by Dr. Smith of concentrate versus a small pool cryoprecipitate, with a knowledge of what was being undertaken in some other European nations, but with Dr. Smith suggesting that the major component of the strategy for England and Wales should be the production of factor 8 concentrates. And I should say that document was a draft produced for a working party on plasma supply. We can then, if we look at the document on screen, see a further memorandum from Dr. Smith to Dr. Lane, dated the 29th of April 1981, on essentially the same topic, small pool freeze-dried cryoprecipitate and other small pool products. You'll see he refers in the first paragraph to a meeting that took place on the 23rd of April 1981 with representatives of the National Blood Transfusion Service and the DHSS, reference to Haemophilia Centre Director representatives stating their preference for intermediate purity concentrate as the major component in the national supply of factor 8. But there's then a discussion about the availability of a degree of cryoprecipitate. And so there's then a discussion under the heading product specification. How should we design this product in response to the stated needs? There's a number of references there set out. You'll see the reference to pool size and a reference there again to the pools in France and Belgium. And then if we go over the page, there's a discussion under the heading plasma sources about plasmapheresis as a major source of plasma for factor 8. He refers to a practice in Belgium of a small panel bled at 10 litres per annum, and then sets out a number of other considerations in that regard. And then we have the heading fractionation technology, and there's a discussion of small volume pools, e.g. 2 kilogram or 10 donations. And then if we go to the next page, a discussion of larger pools, And then he says this approach is dependent on the kind of intensive plasmapheresis programme operated in Belgium and some dilution of the current concept of accredited pools, but would approximate more closely to a defensible process for central fractionation. So it was a discussion document looking at the possibility, as I read it, of the use of substantially smaller pools. Dr. Smith's statements, however, explained that this was not something that was ever put into operation at PFL or BPL. I think that I don't have the reference, or maybe I do. Sorry, if we go back to his witness statement to this inquiry. Yes, perhaps I can just pick it up at page 43, paragraph 119. He described this as, in paragraph 119, as one aspect of his contingency thinking in the very early 1980s, unable to see on the horizon a quick solution through validated screening of donations or some yet unspecified means of inactivating non-A, non-B hepatitis, which at that time posed the most immediate threat. So this was a thought process, consideration, but not actually put into practice, even as a contingency measure. What was done on a limited basis at PFC is what Dr. Smith described as the use of limited donor pools. So, Paul, if we have the witness statement back on page, thank you. So, paragraph 120 refers to the limited donor pools. And if we go over the page, we can see paragraph 123, he says, in contrast to the small pools, paragraph 122, where he says that was never developed. In paragraph 123, he describes how a small number of batches of 8 CRV were produced from limited donor pools. And you'll see there the reference to green 4 plasma. What this was an arrangement for the collection of plasma organised through Dr. Angela Robinson, whereby at her transfusion centre in Leeds, plasma was collected by plasmapheresis from experienced blood donors whose last 4 blood donations had elicited no case of symptomatic hepatitis in their recipients. And they were dubbed Green 4 donors. The donations would be quarantined for a period of 6 months in case there was the intrusion of a late infection of hepatitis. It's somewhere referred to, or elsewhere referred to as restricted donor or restricted panel. So there isn't an entirely consistent use of terminology, but the terminology adopted in Dr. Smith's statement to this inquiry is to refer to them as limited donor pools. Only the Leeds Regional Transfusion Centre was involved in collecting the Green 4 plasmapheresis donations. Dr. Smith's recollection in his statement was that the plan was for these products to be used by Dr. Ritzer in the Oxford Haemophilia Centre, mainly to provide an insight into whether that method of recruiting or obtaining plasma from repeat donors who were thought to have a reduced risk of hepatitis might make a difference to non-A, non-B infection rates for at least the most susceptible patients. Dr. Smith's recollection was that Dr. Ritzer reported verbally to him some apparent transmissions from this product, which would be consistent with 1 or 2 of even these highly selected donors being infective. what Dr. Smith then said in his statement was that this project, this Green 4 restricted pool project, then essentially became caught up in the demand for heated products and essentially was overtaken by heat treatment. If we then, just on the question of whether this is a trial that could have been scaled up to a larger scale in the 1980s, Dr. Smith said this. I'll just find the reference. Page 54. He suggested in paragraphs 154 and 155 of his statement that it wouldn't have been feasible to produce a Green 4 products on a larger scale. He said in paragraph 154 it would have taken almost as much equipment and trained staff to process each of the smaller pools as to process a single larger pool. The QC burden rises. And so he says it wouldn't have been feasible at BPL's scale. Paragraph 155, BPL could not have accommodated the staff and equipment to run multiple 100-litre pools of accredited plasma. And he suggests another major issue would have been the recruitment and training of the teams of appropriate staff. And then paragraph 156, he confirms the proposal or the consideration of the project overtaken by the virus inactivation measures, by which he is referring to heat treatment. That then leads neatly to the question of heat treatment, in which Dr. Smith was very closely involved in terms of the work undertaken at PFL. As you will have heard from Mr. Hill in the course of this week, there were essentially three different ways in which the heat-treated product was made available through PFL or BPL. There was a very limited trial of heating 8CRV, and I'll pick up upon a number of references in late 1983, which led to that project being given heated to 3 patients, but only 3 patients in March of 1984. So that was the first time heated BPL or PFC products, PFL products were used in patients. There was then, in the later part of 1984 into 1985, as Mr. Hill explained, the products of 8CRV and HL that were held in stock or were in the pipeline were heated as an interim measure whilst the production of 8Y was being scaled up. And then finally, there was the production of 8Y rolled out in the course of 1985. I'm going to ask you to look now at Dr. Smith's 1990 draft proof of evidence. At CBLA 5016_034. This contains, of all his various statements and oral testimonies, the most detailed account of the work undertaken in relation to heat treatment. We pick it up at page 12. He explained in paragraph 30, and again, one must obviously understand this was a draft statement, never finalised, and so on, but Dr. Smith said no reason to think it was inaccurate. He said in paragraph 30, my involvement with the idea of heat treatment can be traced back to 1981, during the course of which I reviewed potential research and development work, and he refers to, in the documentation at the time, passing reference to heat treatment, that may be a reference to the documents that both Mr. Hill and I've shown you from 1981. He then said, in paragraph 30, it was not until November/December 1982 that heat treatment began to emerge as a topic for further study. At about the same time, we thought of the possibility of using small pools of donations from donors with a long history of trouble-free donations to provide plasma, and that's the reference to the green 4 plasma that I spoke about a few minutes ago. He then, in paragraph 31, said this: at the time, we had no research and development virology capability at PFL or BPL. The initial catalyst for starting experimental work on heat treatment was informal contact between the Plasma Fractionation Centre in Scotland and PFL in about November 1982. During the summer of 1982, we'd begun to get word of some success in the field of heat treatment through the usual gossip at scientific meetings. And in November 1982, Dr. Peter Foster at PFC telephoned me to discuss some work which they were doing on the heat treatment of factor 9. Dr. Smith then said, in paragraph 32, worth putting the commencement of this activity in the context of some commonly held beliefs in 1982. If we go over the page, I'm not proposing to read these aloud, but it's important to note what he set out in paragraph 33 was a concern or view or attitude at the time that factor 8 could be modified by processing in a way that could potentially be harmful. So that was one of the underlying concerns. And then paragraph 34, just go further down the page, raises the question of yield. And if we go over the page, whether heating might result in a significant loss of yield of factor 8 in the heated product. If we then go to page 15, please, Paul, paragraph 37. We looked at the introduction to this paragraph yesterday when considering hepatitis. And then, as I mentioned yesterday, what Dr. Smith set out in his draft proof is a range of different potential options in relation to ameliorating the risk of hepatitis. If we go over the page, we can pick up towards the bottom of the page pasteurization, and then we'll see shortly dry heating on the next page. So Dr. Smith described here pasteurization, thought to be highly effective against viruses, also familiar and acceptable clinicians through its use in relation to albumin. However, there was still no convincing clinical trial at the time which showed hepatitis inactivation by pasteurization of factor 8. There's reference then to what was understood to be the position in relation to the work undertaken by Beringwerk. And then if we go to the top of the next page, we can see Dr. Smith said in relation to pasteurization and BPL this. He said this, that's a reference to potential problems of recontamination, was compounded by the fact that at the time the BPL production facility had been criticised by the Medicines Inspectorate. The basic problem with pasteurization, as perceived at the time, was that factor 8 would not survive the process without the addition of non-physiological concentrations of preservatives, which might also have the effect of preserving the very viruses the process was being used to destroy. And he sets out a number of other issues relating to pasteurization. And then if we go to the next paragraph, Dr. Smith introduced the idea of dry heating, which we know obviously was what was the solution that was ultimately adopted. It was thought that the low water content of freeze-dried factor 8 would mean much lower virus inactivation efficiency by dry heating than by pasteurization in solution. And then if we pick it up a few lines from the bottom of the page, by the summer of 1982, it had been briefly reported by scientists working for Highland that dry heating, rumoured to be 60 degrees centigrade for 72 hours, prevented the transmission of hepatitis in factor 8 concentrates when the product was used in chimpanzees. And then he refers to unconfirmed abstracts presented by, top of the next page, Rubinstein at a meeting in Budapest in August of 1982. Dr. Smith then sets out a number of other possible methods of tackling transmission of viruses. I don't propose to go through those, but it's right to point out that neither pasteurization nor dry heating were the only options under consideration. Then we go to the next page. Indeed, this is where Dr. Smith made that point. It was therefore against this background in 1982 that thoughts were moving towards heat inactivation. But as will be seen from the description above, this was only one of a number of potential routes to the goal of virus inactivation. It must be remembered that the work was undertaken against the background of hepatitis B ceasing to be of much practical concern and hepatitis non-A, non-B not yet being recognised for the serious condition it later emerged to be. In the circumstances, virus inactivation, whilst desirable, was not an imperative. So it might be thought a sense there from Dr. Smith that whilst these were matters that were being considered, discussed, the practical work in relation to pasteurization and in particular dry heating was still in the future at this point in time, potentially for the reason he described there, that virus inactivation was seen as a desirable goal, but it was the emergence of AIDS which effectively translated it into an imperative. Now, what we then have in Dr. Smith's statement, and I'll just introduce this perhaps before we take the break, is a very detailed account drawn, if we look at the bottom of this page, paragraph 41, from what he talked about, loose leaf books describing the 8H and 8Y experiments. 8H was essentially a product that was developed in the course of the experiments but never actually went into production, never actually used. And then he describes those loose leaf books being based in turn on the primary notebooks used at PFL. And what he describes over the page and in the pages that follow is essentially an almost month-by-month account of the work that was undertaken at PFL. And what I'll do after the break, sir, is I'm not going to read it all out because that would take a very considerable period of time, but I'll just headline the various passages and the various different stages of the work that Dr. Smith then describes. But perhaps I'll do that given the time after the morning break.
Yes, well, we'll take a break now, shall we, until 11:45. 11:45.